Hello everyone, and welcome to the Turkish Center for Global and Area Studies workshop on Kosovo between domestic options and international consequences. As you can all imagine, there are so many of domestic options, I would say, and also international consequences when it comes to the situation in Kosovo, but also in the wider Western Balkan region. And with this in mind, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Leandrit Mehmeti from the University of South Australia. Leandrit specializes in conflict and security studies, as well as democratization and European integration of the Western Balkans. So what I wanted to do really in this webinar is to hear from Leandrit about a pretty broad range of issues, I would say, concerning Kosovo's post-2008 consolidation, and to try really to provide a better understanding of the interests and involvement of both internal actors and external actors in the region, but with a particular focus on Kosovo. I would just like to say for our attendees that if you have any comments and questions, please write them in the chat box so we can address them after Dr. Mehmeti's presentation. So at this point, Leandrit, I would like to invite you to share your ideas with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Branislav, and thank you also to TIGA for the opportunity to address your audience tonight. Well, today back in Turkey. And it is really a great pleasure. As you said, it is Friday night for me here, but it is, it's just a very good opportunity probably to discuss these matters with many people involved and many people interested in the subject. When talking about the topic, Kosovo between domestic options and international preferences, as you may agree also, it is quite a wide area of discussions, and one is pretty much caught in between the elements that one would find relevant. Considering the dynamics of politics in the Western Balkans and with the European Union sort of involvement and other international actors also involved, the involvement of other international actors, it is really very difficult to try and see a particular focus. However, one thing that I think is a general agreement between many observers is that the stability and the long-lasting peace in the Western Balkans really depends on the entire region's integration into the European Union supranational structures. I tend to agree with this statement to a degree, not entirely though. And the reason is mainly because it is true that being involved into a European Union and perhaps even joining the European Union might somehow ensure a long-lasting peace. Not necessarily, though, ensure a solid development of, say, democracy. And even today, when we look at some particular EU members, we see that that has started to deteriorate in different ways. So that is not necessarily a guarantee for those elements. But when it comes to the Western Balkans, peace is more important than any other things. However, reaching the level of peace, obviously, of course, is done through other elements of developments. And mainly here, I mean, the development of democracy and the democratization. So what I wanted to focus tonight, as I said, within all the challenges of what one could talk on this topic, I thought I would be focusing on two elements. One, the development of democracy and democratization, and the focus of Kosovo here, of course. And also briefly focus a bit on the normalization process. So I could probably continue. I had prepared a bit of a couple of slides, I think, that you might maybe share it.
Yes.
Yeah. And this is just a guide to the audience of what we're focusing basically. So as I said, the focus of discussion today is pretty much democracy and the democratization, and as well the normalization process. Now, talking about democratization is really a huge area of discussions, obviously. But I think, and you directed me to a particular focus of the post-independence democratization. However, to understand the prospects of democratization today in Kosovo, one needs to just briefly look at the democratization in general, and just briefly, probably, and I would like to spend just a few minutes on these democracy trajectories that Kosovo has actually gone through in its since the democracy actually has been somehow introduced. Now, as we all know, different contexts, environments, and settings have pretty much shaped different understandings and interpretations of democracy. Complex realities on the ground have pretty much determined different trajectories of democracy development, while a political system transformed and transitioned from an undemocratic to a democratic one, if one wants to use Huntington's approach here on democratization. And throughout history, this has resulted in various types of democracies. Now, because a large number of emerging democracies over the last 3 decades, through different waves of democratization, and the possible danger that such transformations might enable the concept of democracy to deviate from its core base, Collier and Levitsky developed, the concept of democracy with adjectives. The adjectives here are developed and defined to explain those possible features that democracies may take due to different contexts, while preserving the core substance of the basic principle of democracy. However, democracy as a very dynamic and a gradual process progresses and regresses according to the local colors. If one, again, here wants to use John Gering's approach, where democracy is achieved by adding certain properties to minimal definitions or subtracting properties from, say, an ideal type of definition. In the Balkans, democracy has been characterized by such steps, where adding and subtracting different properties, therefore moving steps forward, but also moving steps backwards, which necessitates somehow the need to construct a bit of a frame to understand the concept of democracy that has been developed in the Balkans. Transition, or the democratic transition, over the last 3 decades have been carried out through some successful experiences in some situations and settings, while in some others the success has been followed by very challenging struggles. Environments with such challenges experience the birth of the hybrid democracies, or pseudo-democracies, as Diamonds actually puts it. So often resulting and responding to certain international and domestic pressures to adopt, or probably mimic some sort of a democratic form. The pseudo-democracies experienced those different waves of democratization development that were characterized with some successful, for example, holding successful elections or a smooth transfer of power from one political group to another, which is the case actually in many instances in the Balkans, and especially in Kosovo, but also degenerating into illiberal practices of control of essential institutions related to judiciary. So, here I would like to recall the Zakaria's definition of illiberal democracies. So many countries in the Balkan, including Kosovo, currently, unfortunately, are experiencing a reversion or a regression of democratization development, which will be my focus of discussion here. So, considering that the development of democracy is a very dynamic one, investigating whether a country has started from, say, point A to reach a point B and perhaps use this method as a measurement tool to determine the level of development of democracy may be flawed, probably, and certainly would lack accuracy. The analysis today that I was thinking would instead focus on actions of institutions towards different governance requirements, and a bit of an investigation on how such actions respect and adhere to procedures, and how do they take social considerations into account through efforts to build accountable institutions. Furthermore, how such institutions would be prepared to implement the EU-required standards to ensure that the integration process stands on solid grounds and secures the materialization of such integration. Now, talking about democratization in Kosovo specifically, as you've seen on that slide, it has gone through certain particular phases. Obviously, when it started and when democracy was induced in Kosovo back in 1989 and pretty much 1990s, throughout 1990s, has been characterized, that type of democratization in that time, have been characterized with similar characteristics as in all other successor states of the former Yugoslavia, which were mainly linked to legacies of the conflicts, of wars during 1990s, but also of the communist legacies and certain former authoritarian rules and practices. So compared to other successor states of the former Yugoslavia, democratization in Kosovo was exceptional in the way that that process was linked to the statehood and to the lack of institutions. So Kosovo back in that time lacked institutions to democratize. Obviously, of course, institutions were existent, but those institutions pretty much were not institutions that were accepted by the, especially by the Albanian population in Kosovo. Therefore, one can probably say that it lacked institutions. So the lack of institutions could be considered as a barrier to enabling a more substantial democratization process to take place, something that had been studied extensively in transition and democracy literature over the last 3 decades. While in the post-intervention democracy, and here I mean from 1999, pretty much since the installation of the international presence in Kosovo, that presence was tasked with assisting establishing functional democratic institutions. Yet here, though, different questions probably that were not necessarily asked in that time, and I think are key to understanding all that process and are key to also understanding how democracy is developed if that democracy is somehow imported and it is somehow mimicked. Questions like to whom those institutions those institutions represented. Did they represent state institutions who were accountable to the people of Kosovo, or did they represent institutions of the international administration that were accountable to international institutions? The situation there, as we know, was that obviously, of course, pretty much they were more accountable to the international institutions rather than to people in Kosovo, and therefore it was a bit of an environment of, say, or those years were characterized with a sort of an undemocratic nature of the international presence, if you will. Here, what I mean is the fact that UNMIK, for example, as the governing body in that time, enjoyed the absolute power of decision-making process in Kosovo without being held accountable to the Kosovo population, but instead being accountable to the UN Security Council. Now, within many definitions of democracy, Brzezinski's definition I find to be quite interesting in this context, where he defines democracy as a system in which no one stands above the will of the contracting parties. The point here is who was the contracting parties in that time. And it is quite difficult actually to claim that people in Kosovo were a contracting party. However, though, population did participate in election processes to elect officials. they were, and this is how that contract somehow started to establish. But still, the real power continued to remain in the hands of AMIC. But what is most important in all this process is that the democracy development after independence. And without going into too many details here and bore your audience with all those details of what might have happened there, what I want to focus at this stage is one particular point of how the democracy development has come up to a standstill. Where has it come, and where it has stopped? I would think that the democratization in general has stopped in Kosovo. And obviously, of course, when I say this, it is not entirely accurate, though. Because, again, even though many processes has happened there and many elements of corruption and organized crime and even state capture, which are the elements that have stopped the democratization even today, still, though, there is a bit of a spark in Kosovo, which is also, and you may probably agree with this, it is a spark of positive developments of democracy in Kosovo after independence. And mainly because of the fact that Kosovo does have a good and vibrant opposition, which, for example, situation in Albania is a bit different, or situation in Serbia also is a bit different when it comes to an existing vibrant opposition. And media has played a really huge role in Kosovo, but also many other think tanks. And the very fact that there are hundreds of reports that have been published about corruptive affairs in Kosovo, this is also a sign that, democracy has experienced some development. The problem, though, is that Kosovo today stands very behind in line when it comes to comparing to other countries in the Western Balkans in terms of the European integration, for example. And this is that tricky part, which I have argued in other occasions, is that it comes perhaps to reporting. What do you report and how do you report, and how that report actually reflects the reality on the ground. However, though, when one observes the media in Kosovo, or also these publications of different think tanks, and some of them that I could list here would be for Movement, for example, or Democracy for Development, or Kosovo Center for Investigative Journalism, or GAP Institute, or KIPRED. So all these think tanks have actually made quite a very significant work in unearthing the corruption affairs and reporting about them, reporting about different particular cases of, for example, how a member of the parliament has increased their personal wealth within a year, for example, to up to 400%. Or how another member of the parliament has increased its personal wealth, and that means that it is an unjustifiable wealth, to about 200 and something percent. All these statistics have been investigated in Kosovo by these think tanks. And this, I would say, is a positive sign that the democracy has actually experienced some sort of a level of development. Media, on the other hand, or the pioneering media, an online media called Insider, has published a massive number of investigative reports on the corruption of political actors and groups, about the abuse of power in recruiting party loyalists in different governmental positions, including the judiciary. So those published reports about abuse of budget through the procurement agencies favoring companies and businesses where these particular groups have shares and interest, or even individuals, as well as of the privatization process. So just a simple search onto their online archives gives one access to hundreds of such reports and scandals. And such scandals involve, in all honesty, almost all political parties. I must say here, probably the Vedmendosi movement is excluded from this list, in all levels, local and national, and very high-ranking politicians, from, say, municipal mayors to even the president of Kosovo. So different scandals that have been published, like the Pronto affair or many other similar examples that those who have followed closely a situation in Kosovo might be very familiar. I don't want to bore you with all these details, and probably just to note that I have actually discussed these and have elaborated on these details in your forthcoming edited volume. So without going into all these details, still the point was that those published investigative reports and even including live conversations with phone calls and discussions that were recorded and then leaked out to the public, have demonstrated the degree of the state capture in Kosovo, as well as the challenges and these demonstrate also the challenges that lie ahead to combat the phenomenon of state capture. It also demonstrates the degree of the reaction of the public in a post-conflict environment, and also the lack of a tradition of checks and balances. It has demonstrated the will of the political spectrum that enjoys those social, financial, and political privileges to foster and encourage democratic development and democratization of institutions. Obviously, of course, when one sits comfortably in that situation and enjoying all those privileges, probably, we can imagine how much they are keen to, how much they would be keen to encourage the development of democracy or rule of law, if you will. So this has brought the situation that combating corruption and in this way advancing the development of democracy, in fact, has brought the situation that one may only think that it will require perhaps a new political elite to emerge, because in all honesty, personally, I just don't really see how that is going to be possible with these political actors, considering that all of them has been included in these types of affairs, and the population here is quite aware about this. And the reason is they may have not been aware about these when, for example, those particular reports would be published by different think tanks, because not many people would read them. But population has become very aware when those types of reports had actually hit the media, radio, TV, and social media as well. And this has also, as a result, some groups would go out on the streets and show their dissatisfaction with these developments, obviously mainly encouraged and probably somehow organized by the Vetëndosje movement here, which has played a crucial role on this. And pretty much what I want to say is that it has become aware about all these things. The point is, though, the situation that we have now is that we have reached a standstill position when it comes to democracy development in Kosovo. And that standstill position is it will continue to develop positively only when these things somehow are dealt with. Therefore, I'm not saying, and I'm not very optimistic that they will be eradicated in any time soon, but at least would be put into a more solid solid management and perhaps control to try and encourage probably even the eradication of all these phenomena. One such spark that one may see those positive developments in Kosovo remains with the Vetëndosje movement. And here I don't want to sound, and despite the fact that it is very difficult to probably escape completely the impartiality here, but it looks like that has become pretty much the only hope in a country where the entire hope remains in one political group. I don't really see that to be very encouraging for future developments. It may very well happen. I'm not really sure about it. So when it comes to this element of democratization, it has one can conclude that Kosovo has experienced a sort of a positive development of democratization throughout its stages that has gone, starting from 1990s to early 2000s and post-independence phase. However, though, now it has reached that point that it is quite challenging to move ahead solidly. And how this is reflected to the European Union integration, well, that is quite obvious. Kosovo is the only country in Europe actually that does not yet enjoy visa liberalization with the European Union, and the justification to this is that again it's corruption. Now, yes, of course, one may see and may observe different narratives that are usually developed through media, and also through media that are somehow considered to be affiliated to different political groups, that European Union is to be blamed about this, or that we have done all that was possible, etc. To a degree, that is actually correct. Kosovo, according to the many different reports, including the European Commission, has actually fulfilled all the conditions that were set there. However, I am recalling here a interview of former Minister of European Integration, who was minister in the Kurtis government back in February or March. That interview might have happened. That was a TV interview. And he claimed there in that interview that according to the reports that he has actually seen when he got the position, was that the European Union was requiring specifically to target specific individuals. And he claimed there that there were names. He did not disclose those names, but that there were names that needed to be looked upon in order to proceed further with the visa liberalization, for example, when he was asked about it. The point here, what this tells you is that, again, you reach that point to enter a room, but then you don't enter that room. And the reason why you don't enter that room is because you want to protect certain interests of probably individuals and of maybe different groups. This is the way I see that reality. I may be completely wrong, of course, because I'm not really sure about the accuracy of that statement of the former minister. But I'm assuming that he may have, he has probably spoken with competence on that. On the other hand, when one also sees how Kurtis government was also dismissed within 40-something days, one then here opens the speculations that yes, it might be probably either because of different international plays, but also because of the domestic issues. Now, coming back to our topic here that we said, between domestic options and international preferences, when it comes to international preferences, one of the other things that is important in this aspect is the normalization process, hence my second point that I wanted to elaborate on. And again, without going too much into details about different agreements that were signed and that were implemented, or that were not implemented, I think one of the main points now when it comes to normalization process is the very defining of this process. What this process is going to, how this process is going to end, how this process is going to reach certain outcomes. What are those outcomes? Now, as we have seen, this normalization process have started back in 2011, and now we are in 2020. And we may well be, if even the European Union continues in this way, we may very well make this discussion again in 2030, probably, as the situation is going. Therefore, we are on a path to pretty much nowhere. Yes, we are on a path to claim that we are attempting to normalize relations, but then what is that normalization? What do you mean when you say normalization? This has, I think, this is the main point that needs to be further defined. Whether there is a possibility for this to happen, I would say that it is. It is if, again, especially if Kosovo delegation insists on certain matters, and pretty much insists also on implementing of certain agreements that have remained without implementation, and but also that adheres to its own other agreements that Kosovo side needs to implement and is not implementing. So again, the point here is that this process may continue solidly only when the situation is created for a clearer definition of this process. What does this process will end up? One is not really sure. We can speculate all day that it can reach this point, it can reach that point, but the reality here is that both of the sides, Kosovo delegations, but also Serbian delegations, have entered this process with just, A plans. We have our plan and you have our plan. So no necessarily compromising sort of plans, because it seems that parties still remain into their initial positions, which are drastically distant, one may say. But again, here, there is no way that I see that Kosovo and Serbia will be able to normalize these relationships, whatever that may mean, without the involvement of international community. European Union here, but also other actors such as the United States, but also other actors, including probably Russia in this time, are going to be serious players on this. How is this going to develop further on? Obviously, one may say that it will depend also in perhaps other international agendas. Again, here we're talking about mainly about speculations, but these are mostly geopolitical elements. And us who study political sciences, we know that when we talk about geopolitics, is really a very uncertain sort of an area, and one can never say things for certain. One can never really have a very high level of certainty in these discussions, but one needs to take these things into consideration in order to build some sort of an analysis. So in general terms, when it comes to this, what are the options? Options is moving forward, and moving forward means not necessarily having peace, because peace is already present in the Balkans. And the way the Balkans seems, authorities and political actors seems to understand peace is just the absence of conflict, armed conflict, not necessarily in other certain details. But the way forward here seems to me looks probably the integration to the European Union. Is that a reality for the Western Balkans? One is not really sure now to say. We would have probably thought differently 4 or 5 years ago. Today, European Union itself is is in dire need of further defining of its own goals and further defining of its own backyards or neighborhoods. So in that sense, once that process does not progress, then therefore the way to evaluate the progress in the Balkans also stops. Therefore, if that doesn't progress, also other processes that have started in the Balkans do not progress. They just stay there and, and circle around the vicious sort of a cycle of having some good episodes and then having some bad episodes, having some good experiences followed by other not necessarily very good experiences. So again, that vicious circle. How much the European Union is going to be able to take drastic measures into this aspect is a matter of further discussion, of course, and remains to be seen. On the other hand, European Union always justifies that, lacking of democratization or lacking of rule of law and many other things. This is a very slow process. But again, when it comes to a really materialization of this integration, the normalization between Kosovo and Serbia is going to be the main, perhaps the main point. At least it looks like that now. Can it change in the future? Perhaps. As I said earlier, again, talking about geopolitics is a bit complicated, but they have often, historically speaking, have influenced different developments in the Balkans, and they have shifted different trajectories sometimes in the last moment. So one is never sure how those things are developed. What we can say today is that this is going to be one of the most important elements when it comes to in relation to the European Union integration. But how is that going to develop? In all honesty, I am keen to know, to probably hear and see other opinions, but I'm quite skeptical of further progress when it comes to this situation, when it comes to this process. And the reason mainly here is because it seems to be that lack of lack of the desire to define this process clearly. We have seen, I mean, we have witnessed in many occasions how European Union uses that constructive ambiguity language in all this. And then when you look at, certain interpretations, you can interpret in this way, but then the next day you can interpret them in a different way. This is, of course, done, and this is one of the most common diplomatic sort of ways of reaching certain agreements. But again, when it comes to finalizing something, some sort of a definition is required. Until this process reaches that point, I don't really see how this is going to move forward. Moving forward would be probably, and that can be that preference. If the preference would be that moving forward means let's have an agreement, let's reach that agreement, and then let's reach another agreement on how to implement this agreement, and then let's reach another agreement on how to implement further again this agreement. So again, we're circling into a vicious circle since 2011. We have agreements that were reached back in 2012 that hasn't been implemented. European Union role here can be clearer, of course, and mechanisms are in place to even probably somehow exert pressure to the parties to implement those agreements. I just don't really see the will in the European Union to do so, and mainly because it calls itself facilitator more than a mediator, like an actor who is there to ease the process of dialogue. This is a dialogue that can last for a very long time, and now both parties probably waiting for different international circumstances. This is again what one can speculate, but in conclusion to this point is that the process even this process have reached a standstill position. So back to the entire discussion that I had, both of these elements, democratization in Kosovo specifically, has reached that standstill position, mainly because there is Kosovo lacks a lot in fighting corruption, fighting organized crime, and state capture. But also the other process, the normalization process, has also reached that standstill since 2016, in all honesty. Ever since all that famous tax that was imposed to Serbia, and all the other developments that started to emerge when the idea of partition or border adjustment, or however it was called, based on certain scenes, that process has been there. Yes, we have seen currently some progress, but progress only in terms of let's talk about it again, really. I don't really see that as a progress. And here I'm referring mainly to the late agreements that were signed in Washington, these economical agreements. So there are some movement there, but again, they are only movements to continue that vicious circle. The problem between Kosovo and Serbia is not economical. Problem between Kosovo and Serbia is political. Until this aspect of that normalization is actually discussed and worked with, no other agreement would be very relevant. It is the idea here behind is that the other agreements, for example, the recognition of diplomas or car plates, or all these technicalities, or what they were referred to earlier as technical agreements, yes, they are supposed to ease the way to the final agreement, which is the political agreement. But it seems that these types of technical agreements are agreements that can go on and go on for a very long time. And these are also agreements that, enable somehow the process to just postpone for the next phase, postpone for the next year, etc. And the point is, and that's why I say that it has actually reached a standstill. We could not say this back in 2013 or back in 2014, because we were hoping that these technical agreements might bring us to that phase, probably to reach that. But it is already a decade. And it may very well be another decade if we continue like this. But if we continue, on the other hand, to try and define this process as clear as possible, and also then we take a hand as a European Union, for example, to act as a mediator into this, then European Union does have the mechanisms in place to actually even act as such. And this is that, again, coming back to our discussion, Kosovo between domestic options and international preferences, I would say that when it comes to Kosovo would probably benefit more if it's focused on domestic options more than actually in international preferences. A situation in Kosovo where democratization continues to develop seriously, and when I say continues to develop, I mean continues to develop in such a way that the corruption, for example, is insignificant. Therefore, yes, I'm not saying that it can be eradicated everywhere, because I don't think that happens anywhere in the globe for that matter, but at least it comes to stages to be insignificant, then chances are for Kosovo to even consolidate its own statehood, even internationally. Now, yes, we do have a situation where, for example, 5 European members don't recognize Kosovo. And they don't recognize Kosovo's sovereignty because of their own internal problems, perhaps. The thing is, how would you be able to, why is that important? In terms of European Union, yes, it is important in order to have Kosovo, for example, join the European Union. But how much that is important to consolidate its statehood? I think here democratization, and therefore this is the reason why I focused on democratization tonight, is the key to that, because not necessarily it makes Cyprus or Slovakia or whatever member that doesn't recognize Kosovo to actually do recognize that, because Kosovo has become a really democratic place and has become a really good sort of a economical tiger, if you will, in terms of, say, like other models in the world. That does not necessarily offer you a consolidation of statehood. Take Taiwan, for example. Taiwan has has such a situation, economical situation, but also a very impressive internal political stability. Hence, it is recognized by a handful of countries. But still, the point is, in Kosovo's case, it needs to find the ways to try and reverse probably the opinion of these European Union member states who don't recognize its sovereignty. Enabling a good, or establishing a good, solid democratic country where corruption, for example, is insignificant, and where the prospects of economical progress are present, then chances, I would say, are much higher for that to happen. No guarantee on that, of course, but chances would be much higher to happen. Kosovo lacks even there. Not only it lacks, but over the last years, it has actually experienced some sort of a regress, which has happened actually throughout the Balkans, for that matter. Situation is not better in Albania. Situation is probably even far worse in Serbia. Serbia, for example, today does not even have an opposition at all. Not only today, but since many years. Therefore, as I said earlier, one of the keys to a good democratization development is the existence of a vibrant opposition. No opposition equals to a pseudo-democracy, to refer back to what I said earlier, and not necessarily to a good democracy. So we have come to that situation that when it comes to Kosovo case, I think the main point would be, the main benefit would be focus on an investment on a domestic options rather than, and maintaining an observation of different international preferences, but those international preferences would be much more strengthened probably with a solid domestic progress. Is there any hope in Kosovo that that might happen? Obviously, of course, hope is the last thing that dies, as they say. And I do see that there is a hope. And the reason why I'm saying this is, and again, as I said earlier, it is unfortunate when one puts the entire faith into one political group. And that's not something which is very healthy for any democracy. However, the political group, and I'm referring here to Vetëvendosje, it has, within its very short-lived sort of a period, it has somehow demonstrated a goodwill to fight the corruption, a goodwill to start somehow a disassemble of the state capture. However, though, one also here has to note that almost all political groups in Kosovo had actually, to an extent, have actually acted in similar ways when they would get the power. Take, for example, the PDK, when it took power back in 2007. It has started with a real sort of a great enthusiasm on fighting the corruption, and they did to some degrees, only to establish themselves into those practices. Whether that is a possibility also to happen for Vetëvendosje, of course it may. I mean, it is very impossible to think otherwise. And considering the experience, what has happened with all other political groups, one can never be sure that that is going to happen. That is not going to happen. Sorry. So chances are that yes, I will be probably even disappointed if Vetëvendosje gets a solid government, and fights the corruption in the first couple of years, but then ends up in corruption. Are there any signs around in Kosovo that may have happened? Well, to a degree there are, even within the Vetëvendosje group. Take the administration in prison, for example. It hasn't really been prison here is only one municipality where Vetëvendosje actually governed. And I must say it's one of the biggest municipalities in Kosovo. And the governance there has not really been very, very impressive as people expected. It hasn't been also very bad but people had probably much higher hopes. back in Albanian language, we have a expression, and I would want to end with that expression. I'm not really sure how to say that well in English, but we have an expression where we say that if people tell you that there are a lot of strawberries out there, you take a very small pot. And it may be also that it may be the case that we will see probably a repetition of all this, and then still have the situation that we have today, where we get a democracy that still reaches a standstill point. But again, one needs to, needs to experience that in order to come to that conclusion. Generally, as I said, in conclusion to this, is that Kosovo's path towards the European Union integration is really insecure, and focusing on domestic elements of governance and improving on democracy and democratization, rule of law, mainly, would ensure that that path becomes stronger. Not necessarily becomes secure, but becomes stronger, and progresses in different sort of phases. Also, a focus on domestic options strengthens the state of law. And when it strengthens the state of law, and when it strengthens the rule of law, it strengthens automatically the position, even the position that Kosovo has in international scene. And also, in this respect, it strengthens the position of Kosovo even in the normalization process with Serbia. And such strengthening of Kosovo's position might also be a key to see that the normalization process continues with more hope in sight. As currently as it is really something that it's a process, again, as I said, that circles around a vicious circle more than anything else. I would probably stop here, Branislav, because this is a never-ending sort of a discussion, and perhaps would open the floor for any possible questions. And yes, apologies if I have extended my you're welcome tonight.
Not at all. Thank you so much for your in-depth evaluation of the state of the affairs. And I couldn't stop myself but thinking how the idea of having a plan A only could actually be something that would eventually work. And we saw this from the very beginning of the conflict, that both parties and until today have insisted really on plan A only, in which really one party would end up as a complete winner and the other one as a complete loser of the whole Kosovo drama. And but I also would like you to reflect a bit more on the idea that actually when certain other options, which we could call them Plan B, appeared, be it about partitioning or territorial exchanges, it somehow turned out that actually it was the political elites who tried to use and abuse these ideas for their power maximization and consolidation of their own standing, rather than really thinking of the normalization of the situation. But am I right to believe that actually you are slightly more optimistic than the latest report produced by the European Commission? Because when I was reading the latest report, it seemed more negative than the previous reports, I have to say. And I remember on a couple of occasions, the report was saying, well, Kosovo's judicial system is at an early stage of preparation, and then when it comes to the fight against corruption, Kosovo is at an early stage and has some level of preparation for it. And then when it comes to the fight against organized crime and so on. So if we really look at this report alone, then we would think probably, oh, since 2008, nothing has been done. Whereas actually, if you look at the previous reports, there were certain instances that seemed, I would say, significantly more optimistic than the latest report, which we can then use to actually say, well, for the European Union, this, for example, latest report is a very good excuse to tell Kosovo, yes, you still do not deserve visa liberalization, you still have not progressed enough, you still haven't consolidated enough, and so on and so forth. So while we are waiting for some questions from our audience, I would like to ask you to reflect a bit more on these two points.
I think when it comes to reporting, as I said earlier, most of the evaluation of the situation on the ground, not necessarily actually the report reflects the reality. I'll give you one example. You may remember back in 2015, when Serbia was about to open the negotiations of the chapters, and the situation in the media, for example, was quite dramatic back in Serbia in that time. Not only was dramatic, but with, you know, somehow even with raids in different certain media outlets. And in one of the occasions, I think it was Juncker who was having a press conference together with Vučić in that time, where he was asked by one of the journalists to comment on the late raids. And then he replied, very surprisingly, he replied that something along the lines of, yes, I've heard this, but I want to see evidence. Where is the evidence? You keep telling about these things, but where is the evidence? The evidence was actually on TV a couple of days before. The point here I'm trying to make, Branislav, is that, again, when it comes to, this is that thing when it comes to those international preferences. How do I present this situation? Do I present this situation in a good, positive way in my report? If I do, then I do. If I don't, then I don't, right? In saying this, though, when it comes to the late report that you mentioned, the European Commission's report on Kosovo, I think it's quite a valid report, in fact, because judiciary has actually seen some regress, and fight of corruption has been, hasn't really been impressive. I expect the next report to be even worse. I'll give you one example. A few days ago, government here in Pristina has sacked the anti-corruption task force, which was connected to prosecution. And now, how do you expect the next report to be, to reflect on this situation? And then media speculates today, and over the last week has been speculating that one of the main reasons for that actions was because that task force was investigating some tenders that ranged from 300,000 euros to millions of euros, which were directly involved to the Minister of Interior. Now, all these, when it comes to reporting, all these will be taken into consideration if the international preference would be so. So you said it well. It is a very good excuse now to say that, you stay where you are because you don't deserve this, you don't deserve that. Yes, European Union has these potentials to say anytime they want, really. For any Balkan country, not only for Kosovo. And the thing is, is it comes to reporting. But even though, again, Kosovo has not really performed very well, you may note that there were some reports, including the report of the State Department that usually is also issued on a yearly basis, which praised quite significantly, and that Kosovo has done a huge work in fighting corruption, but they were referring to the government, Kurti's government, back in January and February. Similarly, some reports of the, even coming from the European Union, reflected quite positively on that. The point here that is that we had a government there that did do something about it. At the end of the day, all these governments who took the power before have done the same. Hence your point that some previous reports were actually more positive. Of course, they were positive because there were positive actions on it. But then later it became negative because judiciary started to be captured by other actors. That's the problem.
Right. Thank you very much. We have a question here in the chat box. Could land swap between Serbia and Kosovo lead to conflict instead of solution, meaning prosperity and European integration of the region?
Well, I think, generally speaking, land swaps and arbitrary actions and change of borders historically has always brought conflicts in the Balkans. Take the arbitrary changes back in 1878, take them in 1912, and they have always brought problems. However, back in the day, they brought problems because very, very significant amount of different communities and ethnicities remained under sort of an administration of other larger communities. Take, for example, the Albanian population in Kosovo and in other areas of Serbia proper remained within Serbia. Now that was a huge community, not a very small minority, and therefore the problems there were it was a time bomb that was fixed in a particular period of time to be activated later on, as we have seen. The problem here now is that my question would be here: would that also be the case now? One may say that it may not be the case because here we're not talking anymore about those large communities remaining under the administration of other communities. We're talking about pretty much ethnic borders here, probably. And and the point here is that it is very difficult to be sure whether that would lead to a conflict or it would bring prosperity. I think what would bring prosperity there would be the integration of the entire Balkans to the European Union. Then these problems would become obsolete. They would not be eradicated, of course, but they would become obsolete. The problem of that particular border of this particular municipality in Serbia and the rights, or this particular municipality in Kosovo and the rights of the communities, would then become part of some supranational sort of structures of the European Union. Therefore, borders would not really make much sense. But if the entire region would not join the European Union and the European integration would just remain a distant sort of an objective, then I think any touch in the borders and land swaps, or even how they were recalled even back in 2018 when this discussion started to become quite serious. We have even heard some terminology as some, now I'm losing that word. What was that? Ethnic cleansing, but it was a moderate sort of an ethnic cleansing where you take now Serbs from some enclaves in Kosovo and ship them to Serbia while getting them. So even these discussions were, but I don't really see how that can be materialized without a conflict. So the fear is always there. I'm not really sure whether the land swap between Kosovo and Serbia would lead to conflict at this stage. If that would happen, perhaps it would, but perhaps it wouldn't. But it would still be a time bomb, I would say, if that is not material, if the entire region does not materialize the integration into the European Union.
Thank you. I hope that addresses Professor Bozbash's question. Let's go briefly, while we are waiting for maybe another question or two. Who owns the normalization process? That has a bit remained unclear from your presentation. You touched upon many issues there, but who really owns the process? Because if we take a look how certain aspects of the normalization process have been presented to the public. And I can see, and we are very much on the same page when it comes to that, we are very much concerned about the community out there, right? So on the one hand, we do have elites who are concerned with their power maximization and wealth accumulation, and probably state capturing processes. But on the other hand, we really have the community, and we are very much concerned about the position of the local community, both Serbian and Kosovo Albanian, right? And kind of living together type of thing. So then who owns the normalization process? Because I'm getting an idea that we have different levels of the ownership here, which are not necessarily complementing.
Well, I'm not really sure that I'm understanding your question in terms of who owns it. I think it's. I think you need to give me a bit more.
Is it absolutely? Is it something that is really owned by the two parties, or is it something that is a project presented by the international community? And we have seen so far in the region that projects developed by the international community very often have not been efficient.
Yes, I think. Well, it's quite difficult to say. I don't think in those terms as you're putting them, if I'm understanding them right, I don't think the process is owned by both parties in its entirety. I think it is owned by parties to an extent, but I think it is owned by international community, and here European Union more than it is. Now, the normalization process, again, to try and understand, we have to go a bit back, and probably go back to 2010. We have the verdict of the International Court of Justice on the independence of Kosovo, and then it was created. It was created in an environment, some sort of Serbia was quite insistent that I still did not lose Kosovo, therefore, required some further actions. Normalization was the next action. And it looked like it materialized quite well. And on the other hand, Kosovo entered into that process also with those hopes that, considering now the ICJ's verdict, we may gain a lot from the normalization. The problem was there that I see is, and the lost momentum was the lack of a good strategy on how to approach this by the Kosovo side, unfortunately. If the Kosovo side would have been a bit better prepared how to approach this, probably we would have seen a completely different kind of normalization, and perhaps we would have seen some sparks of normalization. But on the other hand, again, I tend to link this to the domestic issues more than anything else. Because again, dealing with actors who are prone to possible different possible interpretations of things, and with unsecure actors from both sides, it may quite be the case that then the process stands and develops in the way we have seen it has developed. Therefore, trying to circle around a vicious circle more than trying to get to a point of normalization. Now, who owns the process? It's really hard to say, Branislav, in all honesty. I would like to really know this answer for sure, but it's quite
right, because there was a lot of hype around the Washington Agreement, and you saw how President Trump, for example, approached it. And
but you have to understand one thing. Look, you have to understand, Trump for the moment is dealing with his own campaign, and it is quite normal that he would say that I've fixed a 400 years conflict, and I made 20 minutes. I made the leaders to hug and kiss each other. Of course, you're going to say that it's an election campaign, of course, and but I don't think that is something that honestly
that really matters. Yeah,
that needs to be taken really seriously. But however, though, the Washington Agreement, as I said earlier. Again, the Washington Agreement does have some good potential, but again, it's not an agreement as it has been praised, especially as Trump administration wanted to present it as that historical agreement and whatnot. You remember yourself back in 2013, if I recall correctly, we were in a conference together when the agreement was actually signed in April.
Yes.
And how enthusiastic almost all participants of that conference were that this is the historical agreement. And we were one of those that said that this is not historic. History is written differently. And history,
well, if I remember well, you were invited to take part in some ad hoc panel and
yes.
address,
I made a point
address
that
the hype.
This is not a historic. I didn't really see that as a historic sort of agreement. I tend to see an historic agreement when both parties agree that this is our political problem and we are going to see and treat this political problem in the future in this way or in that way. Then I may claim that has been an historic agreement. Other than that, even that famous 15-point agreement, 14 of them were actually completely technical.
Yeah. We have a question here.
Yeah,
a good one, I would say. So, what does the EU have to gain from integrating the Balkans?
Well, this has been one of the main questions over the last couple of decades. Actually, it's quite difficult to say, and there are so many different theories about it. My personal view would be that the only thing that currently European Union would benefit from integrating the Balkans into itself is that it would decrease significantly the potential of the conflict. Nothing else. Therefore, making them part of certain supranational institutions would bind them together in such a way that possible armed conflicts would not necessarily be significant. Possible conflicts, yes, we see conflicts between even European Union members, even today, for that matter. But I think that would be the main gain of the European Union itself. And therefore, I think this is the reason why that hasn't really been that interesting for the European Union. European Union probably, I would assume, want to maybe see more benefits rather than just this. On the other hand, if, for example, they would deem that the armed conflict is not very possible at this stage, then the situation is fine. It's Balkans. I mean, this has been pretty much the approach of the European Union, unfortunately, over the last 3 decades to the region. And judging also with the how the developments have actually happened, one is very difficult to come to a different sort of a approach, honestly.
Right. So, okay, since we do not have any more questions, I'll use the last one, and then we can conclude our webinar session. So now thinking about 2025, that's very popular, and there are so many strategies being drafted looking at 2025 or 2030. I think for the Balkans, 2030 is a bit too ambitious to try to predict. That's my view. But 2025, when it comes to the region, not necessarily just the case of Kosovo, where do you see it? How optimistic can you become, or a bit more optimistic than what you were before?
Yes, I would really love to be more optimistic as I was before, in all honesty. And to a degree, I am. But I am only if a situation in Kosovo changes in terms of, and a new political elite emerges very soon. If that happens, and if that political elite focuses on domestic issues, focuses on the fight against the corruption, and that is possible, despite the fact that some people are also arguing that it is so difficult, and the organized crime has actually spread so much that it is very, very difficult to actually even combat. I don't believe that will be the case, actually. State institutions, at the end of the day, would have the possibility to do that. What they need is the will to do that. So in case a new possible political elite emerges and honestly fights corruption and makes somehow the current actors who are involved in corruptive affairs obsolete, then I think that the chances are that the progress in Kosovo would be, some progress in Kosovo would be visible. That would reflect in the region, of course, because I think that would reflect in the region in terms of its relation with Serbia. That would reflect also in the region in terms of its relation to other neighboring countries, namely Albania and Macedonia, more than with Montenegro, for example. And as such, those possible positive developments might probably create some sparks of hopes in other countries. And here I'm referring more to Serbia and Albania, actually, because these are these two countries that simply opposition does not exist at all. And as I said earlier, a country with no vibrant opposition is pretty much an authoritarian rule. A moderate authoritarian rule, not necessarily putting tanks on the streets, but with the
semi-authoritarian,
a sort of a semi-authoritarian or moderate authoritarian. So it could probably reflect positively. Now, if this is the thing, if this is the desire to see such things, or if this is a real sort of a prospects for that to happen, I'm not sure. I am, though, very hopeful that still Kosovo would somehow hold the key probably to that, but only if a new political elite who can focus and fights the corruption seriously. If not, then we just continue with the same old story that we have had over the last 5 years to the next 10 years.
So let's see if in 2025 I will be asking you this same question about 2030, and you just repeat what you've just said in the exact same way.
And I hope that time I am so much. I would love to say that. How wrong was I? I would love to say these words. Hopefully.
Okay. Well, on that note, if we do not have any more questions, I would like to thank you first of all for sharing your expertise with us, and it's now very late in Australia, I guess.
Yes, it's
so. Thank you. We all wish you a very good weekend, and I would also like to thank our attendees. And we are going to have some more webinars in the coming months, so please stay tuned and join us for some other events.
Thank you also very much for your invitation, and thank you to the university there, and for the opportunity to be with your audience. And I hope I was not too pessimist in my discussion, although I feared that is going to. I feared in the beginning that I'm going to, somehow present doses of pessimism more than of optimism, unfortunately. But that's just one of the ways of how I see the situation. However, though, I did give you some possible sparks of optimism at the end. That I said that if we would have probably some new developments with maybe new actors, I am actually quite positive that my degree of optimism might be realistic. And again, thank you to the audience, and thank you for the questions. It was a real pleasure, and it was an honor to be tonight with you.
Thank you all, and good night. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.